So we will have an event tonight which is very much relevant and very much timely about privacy, open societies, security, information rights, how much freedom should we give up in order to have alleged security, what is the trade-off between the two, what's the trade-off between transparency and privacy. These are the issues we will discuss, first with Edward Snowden, who will be with us on Skype. We will have a moderator, a distinguished political scientist, political philosopher, who teaches political philosophy and human rights at Bard College, Roger Berkowitz, who is the director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard. And then following our discussion, we will have a very distinguished panel. I don't want to steal time by introducing them. All of you have received their CVs. I would like to mention that this is the appropriate place for such an event. Here, under the ground, in the storage, in the archive, we have a lot of clandestine documents collected in clandestine ways. We have hundreds of thousands of biographical files about people, both with information collected from public sources, but also in an unlawful way during the time of the Cold War. Thank you very much for being with us, and Roger, please take over the
floor. We just heard Mr. Snowden talk mostly about national security surveillance. He talked at the end a little bit about the difference between voluntary and involuntary surveillance. You've written that advertising is the original sin of the web, and that in advertising, the web is forces us to be, in order to be free, to give us data, which has led to an incredible rise in commercial surveillance. And I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about what you think the problem of commercial surveillance is in relation to the national security surveillance.
Sure. Well, let me start by saying that it's very encouraging to see a room full of people applaud Edward Snowden without hesitation. In the U.S. right now, I think you would get a lot more hesitation, but I was pleased to see this audience very comfortable with sort of welcoming Snowden here. I think in the discussion about surveillance, there's a sense that the revelations from Snowden have really sort of changed everything, that we know an enormous amount more about what the capabilities of states are now in terms of surveillance, and that we also understand the ambitions and just how broad they are. But I also want to suggest that there's a funny way in which, unfortunately, I feel like Snowden's revelations have changed very, very little, in that what we have not seen is a mass movement to challenge the US government's behavior, the behavior from the other Five Eyes. And we particularly have not seen a mass movement of people abandoning their mobile phones, shutting down their Facebook accounts, and generally asserting that they are looking for significantly less data collection in their lives. And I think there's a tendency to look at that and say, well, no one cares. Clearly, we're in a post-privacy environment. Clearly, no one actually has this as a major concern. And I think that's totally wrong. I think that's entirely off base. I think what's happening instead is that we are now being forced to confront a reality in which surveillance is so pervasive and it's so much an ordinary part of everybody's life that it's very hard to imagine stepping away from it or opting out of it. I think one of the key things to sort of understand, when we talk about what Snowden has spoken about, we tend to think of this as state surveillance. We tend to think of the NSA as our adversary. And the thing that's really critical to understand is that so much of what the NSA has been able to do is basically built on the everyday ordinary practice of corporate surveillance. The fact that we have allowed the building of systems that track us every moment of every day, that are in many cases only very loosely regulated, is for me the outrage within all of this. I'm willing to bet that everyone within this room is carrying a device which tracks their movements, as Malte has so helpfully talked about in his work. And I think everyone has now found themselves in a position where, whether or not they're a member of Facebook, they're almost certainly encountering ads on the internet, which means that they are somehow gaining a data doppelganger, which is basically a saleable commodity. We have, on one level or another, accepted a reality in which, in exchange for zero-cost services on the internet, we have agreed to be marketed as a commodity.
Edward Snowden made a point that perhaps we haven't been very good at explaining, and so one of the things that we've been trying to do is actually shift the debate a little bit. At the moment, the security debate is very much framed in negative terms. It's basically about keeping harm at bay. So security is merely defined as the absence of a threat. And the solutions that our societies have come up with have very much focused on governments and corporations then having control over providing that security or keeping these threats at bay. The consequence of those measures has been a real disempowerment of the individual. We ourselves are able to control how to keep ourselves secure less and less. And I think the debate about making encryption illegal is, again, one step further in that whole debate. But you can also have positive conceptions of security, and the whole debate about food security is actually a really good example of that, where security is about your ability to access a resource and then use it according to your own needs and preferences. Obviously, the ability to control how much you reveal of yourself is relevant everywhere, though it's true that people will make that decision based on different parameters in different societies, quite likely. In addition to the right to privacy, though, very important is also the right to freedom of expression, because the right to privacy does not cover the full ground of being able to act fearlessly online. Then maybe just to kind of finish, there's a lot of debate also about what does that mean in terms of operationalizing privacy then? How do you deal with this? And I think it's really important that we start to foreground more and more the notion of consent. What have we actually consented to? And not just at an individual level, but also at a societal level in terms of the social contract that we have agreed to with our governments.
And the point you were asking for when I sued Deutsche Telekom to get access to my mobile phone data, it was the only point I asked them, please hand me over all the information you store on me. And Deutsche Telekom is a really large company, and after half a year or a year of a legal battle, they handed it over to me. And just to get an overview, this is my mobile phone data only from one weekend, 16 pages long. 1,200 individual informations, only for 3 days, so that you can see what is going on. And this is 6 years old. There aren't 80 apps on my smartphone at that time. So just to get an impression, and the only way I could get access to it was through my legal case against them.
As an American citizen, on the one hand, I'm glad that this information is out there. I share the the critique and general unhappiness with some of the NSA bulk data collection mass surveillance programs. I consider them problematic, unnecessary, potentially prone to very serious abuses, and I think it is good to be having an informed discussion about them. On the other hand, at the time of Snowden's disclosures, those same programs had been approved by all three branches of the American government, the executive branch, Congress, and the judiciary. And it's not completely unproblematic in a democracy for one citizen to take a program that has been lawfully adopted in a democracy and share it with the world. It may be the fact that the world isn't better off in the long run, but I don't think it's an easy case. So I put out that ambivalence there to start with. Whenever I hear people talk about privacy versus security, or what do we do about these various infringements on our privacy by variably Google, Facebook, corporations, my next door neighbor, the NSA, the Five Eyes, the Four Eyes, every other eye in the world, everybody seems to be surveilling everybody. I always start thinking, what exactly are we talking about when we say privacy, and why exactly are we worried? And I think that we use the term privacy in an incredibly careless, squishy, sloppy way, often without any effort whatsoever to clarify, we're worried about this because why? It's so the telephone company collects Malta's data, and that's bad because why? And then the answers usually turn out to have very little to do with privacy, I think. The answer is when we push a little bit deeper, whether we're talking about NSA mass surveillance and bulk data collection, or whether we're talking about telecom companies or Facebook, the answer turns out to have very little to do with privacy and more to do with a very well-justified fear of abuses of power and lack of accountability of the powerful. Specifically, we worry that the phone company is collecting Malta's data, not because there is some abstract, terrible harm about this data sitting in some server somewhere that nobody's ever looking at because they're not interested. We're worried about it because we think, hey, wait a second. You know, someone could hack into that. They could use the information to blackmail Malta. They could use the information and come up with all sorts of erroneous conclusions and decide, aha, look, he was in the same pub as a terrorist suspect on 5 occasions. He's probably a terrorist. Let's do the following to him that we think would be bad. The same is true of NSA bulk data collection. We have these very complicated pattern recognition software that tries to say, oh ho, look at these people. They had 63 different contacts with known terror suspects. Obviously, they bear watching. We need to take a close look at them. Well, that might be because they're a terrorist too. It might be because they're the pizza delivery guy and they're getting a lot of calls to and from terrorists who like pizza, right? And we don't know that. And we're worried about people finding themselves under suspicion on a no-fly list, blackmailed, etc., because this information gets misused.
And so the question becomes, what can we do about this in a way that's actually effective? I think a very helpful first step on this would be to go after a theory of change through law, where we start saying, actually, we do want some limits on this, and we want to think about potential harms, we want to think about consumer protections. Thus far, I've seen very, very little movement on that front. So I'm actually starting to have hope for some other theories of change. One of the most interesting things that's happened in the commercial surveillance space recently is YouTube declaring that they are going to start offering a service which is ad-free for about $9 a month. The interesting thing is to see whether we can get YouTube to commit to being tracking-free as well as ad-free. And that would be a very, very interesting development if that ends up happening. If you could start seeing Facebook say, we're not going to sell that profile on you, but we will provide the service, for instance, for $10 a year. If that doesn't work, some of the things that Snowden is suggesting make a great deal of sense, which are code-based theories of change. I now, instead of using text messages, for the most part use a service called Signal. It's incredibly easy to use. It's very cryptographically strong. If you do one thing coming out of this room, put Signal on your phone and start using it, because it disables mass surveillance. And what this really comes down to is we have to have a change of norms. We would have to have a societal movement where a whole lot of us say, no, actually this matters a great deal to me. I just haven't known what to do about it. That's the change that I can imagine us having as a reaction, not only to the pervasive corporate surveillance, but to the ways in which the state surveillance and corporate surveillance have become, as some have called it, a surveillant assemblage, because that's really what we're fighting.
Great. I want to just say one last thing at the end here, and in a way bring us back to Edward Snowden at the beginning, who talked about courage. And that is that, if anything, what I hope these four panelists and Edward Snowden helped us see today is that privacy is something that it's very easy to say, yes, I'm in favor of it, but actual privacy is often dangerous. Actual privacy is inconvenient, and actual privacy is often in favor of the privileged and often anti-democratic. An artist who creates in private is not always a very good person. People who raise children in private or often teach them things that we wouldn't want them to be taught. In a sense, in a liberal society, we have to have the courage to let people fail and do things that we don't like in private. And if we're going to defend privacy, we're going to have to be honest about that and imagine a defense of privacy that includes a defense of people who are outside the norm, who are dissenters, who are people we don't like, and have the courage to let those people exist in our society, have a voice in it, as long as they do respect the laws when they come into the public sphere. And that is, I think, one of the hardest. It's one of the reasons I think this debate on privacy has been so flawed, not here, but around the world, because we think of privacy as something good and easy and we want. But there's a reason that we have been losing our privacy for a long time, and it's often because privacy is quite difficult and unsavory. And I will end and give it to Istvan for a final word.
Thank you, Roger, both for the moderation and for this contrarian words at the end. It's a paradoxical ending of this discussion. I would like to thank our experts on the panel and Ed Snowden and everybody who helped us for this to happen this afternoon.